Granbury General Hospital, a memoir by Linda Brock. With the threat of losing yet another valuable piece of Granbury's history, I am compelled to share some of my recollections associated with Granbury General Hospital. The structure itself is a beautiful example of mid-century architecture, but more importantly, a repository of stories and experiences that deeply define the development of the town/city that I so proudly have called home for the majority of my 73 years. The hospital was built in 1946 by Dr. L.G. Ballard, and I am told had 8 beds and a small office where Dr. Ballard practiced medicine. I will begin my recollections in 1952, when I arrived at 6 years of age with my mother, Billy Brock, and my dad, Dr. Roy L. Brock, who was invited to partner with Dr. Ballard and share his busy practice. At that time, I'm guessing that there were around 16 beds in the hospital and an office for my dad as well. If my parents were not aware of the nature of life in a small town, they were in for a culture shock. When my dad and mom drove out to sign the papers for the practice, I stayed in Fort Worth with my grandmother and granddad. It seems that a cow was casually making its way across the entrance to the city limits about the time my mom and dad approached. My dad swerved to miss the cow and rolled the car in the process. They were both fine, which was especially good news, as my mother was pregnant with my soon-to-be little brother, Rudd. They continued on to seal the deal with Dr. Ballard. The next day, my dad hit the floor running, and after a busy morning seeing patients and acquainting himself with the practice, he made his way to the local cafe for lunch. As he walked in, he heard a local holding court in the cafe, recounting the events of the previous evening. He said, "Did you hear about the new doctor in town? Well, he drove into town, almost hit one of our beloved cows, and not only that, he was drunk and with a woman that was not his wife." With that, my dad walked over and said, "May I introduce myself, Roy Lee Brock. I am the new doctor in town, and by the way, I was not drunk, and the woman in question was very much my wife." Granbury General was located right in the middle of town, just barely a block off the town square. I loved walking to the hospital and hanging out in the waiting room until my dad would pop his head around the door and ask if I would like to go to the Mecca Cafe, located in the old Red Bank building, for a chocolate malt and a package of peanut butter crackers. It had 8 stools only and was always bustling. My mother never minded, as she was busy with my baby brother and welcomed some downtime. If I was ever bored while waiting around for my dad, I would walk up and down the halls, hang out with the nurses, or indulge myself in one of Emma Perkins' famous apricot fried pies. Emma's meals were highly sought after, and arguably the best in town. By the way, Emma Perkins was mother to Johnny Perkins, who was a star running back in Granbury and went on to play for the New York Giants. The football stadium is named after him. Mrs. Hendricks, a beloved nurse, would regale me with tales of her great-uncle, Davy Crockett. If the locals came to town for groceries or whatever supplies they might be in need of, from tires to Milton Kennan's homemade chili, they more than likely would swing by the hospital to find out who was sick and stroll down the hospital corridor, peering in to see if there might be a patient in need of a visit or a word of cheer. It wasn't uncommon to see Terry's funeral truck pull up to drop someone off at the hospital when they needed care. Life in Granbury was pretty sweet, and there was a sense of community that made you feel safe, loved, and comfortable. Our children and grandchildren should be so lucky. Dr. Ballard moved away from Granbury to pursue a specialty in urology and left my dad in charge of a now bustling practice. It was not unusual to hear the phone ring in the middle of the night and to hear the clanging of my dad's doctor bag as he took out to all parts of the county. Many times he would be out all night, change clothes quickly, and be in the office by 8 a.m. He invited his dear friend Robert Rawls to join him, and the two of them enjoyed a happy partnership. I don't think they ever had a formal agreement, or an argument for that matter. I can remember many an evening when we would share a meal with Uncle Bob and Aunt Jerry, when my dad would reach in his pocket and say, "I was called out to so-and-so's home last night, and here's your half," probably a $5 bill, if I remember correctly. My grandparents moved with us to Granbury and operated a small grocery store on the north side of the square called Aiken Grocery. They lived behind us and were constantly with us. In fact, I thought everyone's grandparents moved wherever their children moved. Nanny was a self-appointed midwife in her earlier years and quite the healer. I still have nightmares of her chasing my brother and me with an enema bag. It didn't matter what our ailment might be, an enema was the treatment of choice. We had frequent calls at our home for my dad, and sometimes when he couldn't be reached, they would just come to our house and hang out in the living room until my dad arrived. It wasn't unusual for my mother to say, "Kids, don't go in the living room, there are sick people in there." Often when a patient would call our house and my dad was not available, or even sometimes when he was, they would ask to speak to my grandmother. Nanny would listen to their complaints and recommend her own treatment plan. My dad adored my grandmother, but this was getting out of hand. I remember when he sat her down and explained malpractice to her and told her that she was no longer allowed to intervene in his practice. She was not happy, which meant she didn't say a word, just bang pans and slam doors in the kitchen. By this time, my dad had added another friend and his wife, who was also a doctor, Constance and Russell Jenkins, to the practice, and a new addition was added to the back of the hospital. My dad was encouraged to join the race for school board and won handily. Mother was on the city council, so we were politically connected, as were most citizens of Granbury. My dad was involved in an unpopular ruling on the school board, at least unpopular to Unibeth Lewis, who lived across the street from the hospital. She wore men's clothes, including brogan work boots, and at exactly 11:45 a.m., she would leave her house, walk over to my dad's car, and hurl a large wad of spit onto the driver's side of the car in protest. My dad never lost his temper that I saw, but would arm himself with a bottle of Windex and a rag as he left to go home for his noon meal. This kept on for several months, and then she was off on another tangent. People seemed more tolerant then. One night, a mighty storm rolled into Granbury. The fire department called my dad and advised him to come to the hospital in anticipation of potential injuries. My mother and grandmother were deathly afraid of storms, and we didn't have a cellar. So as my dad headed to the hospital, my grandmother, my mother, my brother, and I headed to a friend's cellar and awakened them in the middle of the night and informed them of the certain danger. We all crowded into the cellar to await the tornado. Hours passed, with the most momentous event being the canning jars full of fruit and vegetables that were flying off the shelf as my brother Rudd became more and more rambunctious. We slowly peeked outside, and all of the clouds had disappeared, so we made our way home before daybreak, only to find my dad fast asleep, having fallen into bed exhausted without missing a one of us. Needless to say, the air was a bit frosty for a few days, and I'm not sure our friends, the Boozers, ever invited us to their home again. My dad worked hard and played hard. He was in the Air Force and loved to fly planes of all sorts. If business was slow at the hospital, he would call his friend Gerald Bowser, who had a landing strip on his ranch, jump in the car, and shoot a few landings between appointments. As long as the windsock was white, he was home free. But when Gerald's wife, Gwen, changed the white sock to red, he knew to hightail it to the hospital. Oh well, I could go on, so I will take my own advice and bring this epistle to an end. There are hundreds of stories out there that are just as personal as mine and just as important. And many are tied to a home, a place of business, a place of worship, a tree, a piece of land, and so on and so on. The stories matter, not only to those that live them, but to those who pass our way long after we are gone. Obstacles such as asbestos are dangerous, troublesome, and expensive to remove. But erasing the footprint of small-town America in exchange for a parking lot? Really?